I've been spending a lot of time lately revisiting older movies that I have not seen in years. One film from 1990 in particular, one that is often dismissed as shallow and problematic, held a lot more power for me watching it as a middle-aged man than it did when I was younger. That film is, of course, Problem Child starring John Ritter. Daddy! I also rewatched Pretty Woman. I had not seen Pretty Woman since I was a teenager, and my memories of it were very fuzzy. Mostly I remember it as a film that my grandmother liked a lot. Its influence on 90s romantic comedies is almost as big as that of Rob Reiner and Nora Ephron's When Harry Met Sally, which came out the year before. This is kind of odd when you consider the film's premise is about a hooker and her client who fall in love with each other, which is also a source of most of the criticism of the film. The movie was designed to be a star vehicle for Julia Roberts, and it succeeded in making her arguably the biggest female movie star of the 90s, even though no film she has made since has had the same cultural impact. I routinely speak to young women who weren't even born when this film came out, who know it and love the movie. Pretty Woman is an over 30-year-old film, which is hard to believe, but what's even more difficult to believe is how much it's still watched and beloved now, even though it isn't a film very much respected by cinephiles. Part of this is the gender divide that still exists in film lovers circles. Pretty Woman is a movie that is popular with mostly women, and there has always been a mentality that films that appeal to women are less serious than films that appeal to men. This sometimes leads to some really reductive feminist takes, where pure trash is defended because its audience is mostly women, but there is some truth to the idea that women's pictures are historically taken less seriously. Unlike When Harry Met Sally, though, where the writer at least was a woman, both the writer and director of Pretty Woman are men. And one of the most interesting things about the movie was that the original script by writer J.F. Lawton was a gritty drama called 3000. After rewatching Pretty Woman, I found the script for the first time and read it. I wasn't blown away by the things that were different, so much as I was blown away by the things that were the same. The structure of the basic story is very much the same in 3000. There aren't many scenes that aren't also in Pretty Woman, and when there are differences, the scene replaces an equivalent scene in the original script. There are also only a few scenes that are added to the script after the rewrites. Lawton is the only credited writer on the script, and most of the rewritten material was either done by him or director Gary Marshall. The biggest difference from the script is the character of Edward. He is much less likable, and what most people know about the original script is the two do not end up together, though Julia Roberts' account of how the film originally ended is incorrect.
At the end of the original script, Richard's character threw my character out of the car, threw the money on top of her, and drove away, and the credits rolled.
3000 begins with Vivian instead of how Pretty Woman starts with Edward. Vivian is a crack addict in the original script, and her relationship with her friend Kit is very different. In Pretty Woman, Kit is like a big sister to Vivian, where in the original script it is reversed. Vivian meets Edward in a similar way. He's lost, but he doesn't stop and ask for directions. Instead, he just sees Vivian and is infatuated with her. This version of Edward uses call girls on a regular basis, though he has a girlfriend, who he is angry at for putting her modeling career above him. In the script, he refers to her using misogynistic slurs and belittles her for her career. The dialogue after Edward picks Vivian up and they're going to the hotel room is different, but the content and purpose of the scene is the same. Vivian is still shocked by how opulent the hotel is, and when she asks Edward if he has a wife or a girlfriend, and he says both, she asks if they are screwing each other instead of if they are shopping together. The scene where they negotiate the price for the week is very different, because Edward initially offers her $2,000 but then insists she doesn't do drugs for the week, which ups the price to $3,000. What was most surprising to me was that this dialogue was still in the script.
Baby, I'm gonna treat you so nice, you're never gonna wanna let me go.
3,000 for 6 days. And Vivian, I will let you go.
The scenes where she goes shopping and the salesgirls are rude to her are almost exactly the same, and so are most of her interactions with the hotel manager, played in the film by Hector Elizondo. Certain dialogue has changed because much of the original dialogue is very serious or outright profane, and the dialogue in the movie is more comedic. A lot of things in the second half of the script are the same as well. Edward is trying to buy a company so he can strip it and make a profit. He takes Vivian with him to negotiate with the owner. He also still takes her to the opera, though it is a different opera in the movie and in the script. 3000 is much more about class than Pretty Woman is, and Edward is portrayed as borderline sociopathic, though much of this commentary is so on the nose that it removes any tension from the story. The audience knows that Edward is a bad guy and will change, even if Vivian doesn't. There is no polo match in the original script, though the fight between Edward and Vivian still occurs. Edward angers Vivian when he talks about her being a prostitute in front of his friend William, who was replaced by the character of Stucky in the movie. In the script, William runs an escort service. Vivian still threatens to leave and refuses the money, and Edward still convinces her to stay. She still says,
You hurt me.
but doesn't say,
Don't do it again.
Vivian still tells Edward she loves him while they are lying in bed. The scene where Stucky assaults Vivian is in the script, but it is William this time, and he tries to recruit her for his escort service rather than just tries to sleep with her. The ending has Edward dropping Vivian off where he found her, and her getting upset. She at first refuses to take the money, but he tries to convince her, saying she'll regret it later. Vivian throws the money at him and screams after him while he drives away. The script ends with her returning to Kit and offering to take her to Disneyland with the money that she got from Edward. Reading the original script, I have to admit that the film is much better. In addition to the original script lacking subtlety and complexity to its characters, Vivian's crack addiction adds nothing to the story. She is shown struggling with withdrawal in one scene where she is smoking cigarettes and wondering how she can get through the week, but her behavior isn't much different than the character's behavior in the finished film. The script has nothing meaningful to say about drug addiction at all. Rewatching Pretty Woman, I found myself thinking that the film is much more serious and thematically rich than it is ever given credit for. Most of the criticisms of the film have to do with the premise and its portrayal of sex work. The portrayal of the life of a sex worker in the film Pretty Woman, as opposed to how it was in the script 3000, is not trying to be realistic. One of the smart things that director Gary Marshall did when he took over the project was to see the dynamic between Vivian and Edward as more of a metaphoric device for the intricacies of heterosexual relationships, gender roles, and the influence of money under capitalism. I don't think there is a way to make a film that addresses the subject of sex work in a way that would not be criticized by one group or another. Portray it too positively and you'll be accused of glamorizing it and glossing over the exploitation of women. Portray it too negatively and you'll be accused of either judgmental moralizing or being a swerve. Even Paul Thomas Anderson's Boogie Nights was accused of being anti-porn when it was released, because it portrayed its characters as sad and lonely people searching for family. Rewatching Pretty Woman, the idea that anybody could find it offensive for its portrayal of sex work is bizarre to me. It certainly doesn't portray Vivian's life as glamorous, and the film includes an early scene where we see a sex worker has been murdered. Vivian also has some issues with a local drug dealer, even though she is no longer a drug addict herself in this version. Both of these elements address how Vivian is vulnerable trying to earn money in a practice that is illegal. Vivian is much less of a stereotype than she was in the 3000 script. Her job isn't ideal, but she takes it seriously, and is portrayed as a way to make a living without any moral judgment. There are also references to how Vivian ended up in such a position. Though she is not a drug addict, there is a scene where Edward thinks she is doing drugs in the bathroom, and she says the line,
I don't do drugs, all right? I stopped doing drugs when I was 14.
She also confesses that she was a high school dropout, and that she came to Los Angeles by following a bad boyfriend. All these things allude to a bad childhood. I think this portrayal of Vivian's life is pretty balanced for a film that isn't about sex work directly. Of course, that also means that it is easy to read whatever you want to get offended about if you are incapable of understanding nuance. There is also a common complaint about the film that Vivian is portrayed as a special sex worker who is worthy of being saved, while her friend Kit is not. This strikes me as a pretty bad reading of the movie. The movie acknowledges that its portrayal of a romance between a wealthy businessman and a hooker is unrealistic. Kit is portrayed as the more down-to-earth and practical one in contrast to Vivian's romanticism, but the movie ends with Vivian helping Kit out and Kit talking about her plans to go to school and not turn tricks forever. Nothing really horrible happens to Kit, and her most negative trait is having a crass sense of humor. The fact that some viewers see a huge gulf between Vivian and Kit on a moral level seems to say a lot more about them than it does about the film. Many tie this interpretation with the hooker with the heart of gold trope in films, but the idea that the hooker with the heart of gold is supposed to be some special exception while other sex workers are portrayed negatively seems to be a weird interpretation that doesn't bear itself out when looking at actual films that are accused of using this trope. For example, Billy Wilder's Emerald Deuce tells the story of a cop, played by Jack Lemmon, who falls in love with a sex worker, played by Shirley MacLaine. But although MacLaine's character is the one that catches the eye of Lemmon's character, the movie contrasts the police with the prostitutes to mostly criticize the cops, not the other way around. Though Lemon's character concocts an elaborate scheme to have Irma all to himself, the film never judges sex workers, nor portrays Irma as superior to the other women in any other way. The trope also sometimes appears in thrillers like Alan J. Pakula's Clute or Brian De Palma's Blowout, where a male hero meets a sex worker through some kind of investigation and becomes romantically involved with her. Once again, this idea that this woman is somehow special and deserves to be saved is never in any of these films. What is most prevalent is just the idea that these characters are actually nice people who aren't morally corrupt in comparison to the forces that the hero is struggling against, who are supposedly more respected people in society. Nothing in Pretty Woman is really that out of line in what you see in a traditional romantic comedy. There is a shift of who the main character of the story is. Traditionally, the main character of the story is said to be the one who changes the most. In the 3000 script, it is Vivian who unquestionably goes through the most change. But in the film Pretty Woman, it is Edward. Vivian does find herself affected by her time with Edward, but Edward rethinks his entire life and career after meeting Vivian. He's a totally different person from the beginning of the movie to the end. Yes, this is unrealistic, but it's also the kind of arcs you routinely see in films, especially in romantic comedies. Pretty Woman, despite its origin as a serious drama, was reshaped to reflect the kinds of themes that are present in the classic romantic comedies of the 1930s and 40s. Director Gary Marshall opens the film with an image of a sleight of hand trick involving money. This clues the viewer into what the film is really about. The role of money in sexual and romantic relationships is a theme going back to the very beginning of the romantic comedy genre. It actually goes back even further than that. Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice even includes a lot of the tropes later present in cinematic romantic comedies. Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy start out disliking each other, but gradually fall in love. Just like the characters in It Happened One Night and When Harry Met Sally. That book and its many adaptations is a comedy of manners, but its main concern is the need of women to marry for status and money in its time period, and the obstacles it provides for romantic love. Pretty Woman is about the role that money plays in relationships during the time it is set, which is coming off the greed is good 1980s and its backlash against the feminist movements of the 60s and 70s. Making the film about the relationship between a corporate raider who comes from old money and a sex worker who is struggling to survive is an extreme contrast that illustrates the point. Edward has been rewritten to be a man struggling with emotional attachments. He is raised by an emotionally distant father who provided him with wealth but no real love. They haven't spoken in years when his father died. Edward has transferred this dynamic to his romantic relationships. In the early scene on the phone with his girlfriend, we learn he provides for her financially, but she is expected to be at his beck and call. He seems to think emotional needs are not important as long as he provides financial support. When Edward picks up Vivian, he sees a chance to have an honest version of this relationship. She can be his employee in the literal sense. This scene illustrates this perfectly.
Hello? Edward, it's Phil. Listen, I'm running out the door. I just want to let you know Morse is all set for tonight.
Oh, that's good.
He's bringing his grandson. He's grooming him to take over. I don't.
Oh, yes. Very intense young man named David. Plays polo.
Look, I gotta say this again. I don't like you going alone, you know? Look, well, I just think it'd be better if you went with a date, you know? Keep it social.
Got the note.
Edward?
Talk to
Do you hear me?
baby.
Yes. Yeah, I'm here.
If
What
you
is that?
want to impress me,
Housekeeping is singing.
got to meet too flirty mama. I know how to
Yeah.
undress me.
Listen, Edward, I know a lot of nice girls.
No, you don't.
I just want your extra time and your kiss.
Besides, I already have one.
If you want to impress me,
You just concentrate on finding out what Morse is up to.
be too flirty mama.
I'm on my way.
I know how to undress me. Yeah, baby. I wanna be your fantasy. Well, maybe you could be mine. You just leave it all up to me. Don't you just love Prince?
More than life itself.
Don't you knock?
Vivian, I have a business proposition for you.
What do you want?
I'm going to be in town until Sunday. I'd like you to spend the week with me.
Really?
Yes. Yes, I'd like to hire you as an employee. Would you consider spending the week with me? I will pay you to be at my beck and call.
Look, I'd love to be your beck and call girl, but you're a rich, good-looking guy. You could get 1,000,000 girls free.
I want a professional. I don't need any romantic hassles this week.
If you're talking 24 hours a day, it's gonna cost you.
Oh, yes, of course. All right, here we go. Give me a ballpark figure. How much?
6 full nights, days to 4,000.
6 nights at 300 is 1,800.
You want days too?
2,000.
3,000.
Done.
Holy shit!
Edward treats Vivian with such disregard that he walks into the bathroom without even alerting her to his presence. Yet the chemistry between the two actors makes his infatuation with her obvious. Their negotiation about money is a negotiation over how much he needs to give of himself in order to get what he wants. The relationship with Vivian is supposed to be a way for him to get what he wants without giving anything of himself. But through his time with her, he finds himself having feelings that he didn't expect, leading to this line toward the end of the movie.
Stay. Stay the night with me. Well, not because I'm paying you, but because you want to.
For Edward, who has expressed affection through money his whole life, there is suddenly a fear that nobody could care for him without it. His money functions as a shield from his emotions and a sense of control over his partner. Vivian wants him to give up that shield and control. The change that occurs in Edward is when he stops thinking about money meaning everything. He changes his mind about stripping the company he was planning to buy, and then he takes a leap of faith with Vivian. The ending of Pretty Woman is not perfect. It wraps things up in a bow a little too neatly, and Edward's change seems instantaneous. But it does address the hooker with the heart of gold trope and tells us it's not Vivian who is being saved, but Edward.
So what happened after? He climbed up the tower and rescued her.
She rescues him right back.
One of the consequences of this ending is that the film has a muddled relationship with capitalism. While the original script's portrayal was too on the nose, its message was never in doubt. Vivian is seduced by the opulence of Edward's lifestyle, even though the actions that afforded this lifestyle are highly unethical. Edward is revealed to be soulless, and the idea he could be anything to Vivian is a pipe dream. The original 3000 script makes it clear that while society judges Vivian's profession, it is far more ethical than the one that Edward is involved in. The rewritten Pretty Woman wants to have it both ways. Edward spoils Vivian with his money, but the movie then wants us to accept that despite the fact Edward gained much of his wealth through predatory business practices, that he has a sudden change of heart. The film is ultimately too timid to criticize capitalism on a systematic level, leaving ethical concerns at the level of personal choice. The fact that Edward has become a more ethical capitalist is sufficient. Yet the film still retains some elements of the class critique of the original script. The cruelty that Vivian is treated by the sales girls initially is one example, but during this sequence, Gary Marshall includes a number of visual gags. One of these is a man driving by talking on his cell phone, which in 1990 was still a luxury item possessed mostly by wealthy professionals. We see a kid in the car with him on a toy cell phone, a gag that may feel dated because children with cell phones are now common. Yet in the context of this movie, it portrays a representation of class. The original 3000 script includes references to old money versus new money, with Edward being an old money tycoon, parasitically dismantling new money businesses when they are at their weakest. This one visual gag in Pretty Woman represents that whole mindset, the idea that the children of the wealthy will become wealthy themselves, not from their hard work, but from the privileges afforded them by the social status and wealth of their parents. Conversely, Vivian is a hooker not from a moral failing or a lack of intelligence, but because of the circumstances she was born into and other factors beyond her control. Several times throughout the film, Vivian states her independence from the influence of men by saying that she says when and who. She discusses with Kit at the beginning of the film the advantages and disadvantages of having a pimp. The film also portrays her agreement to enter the arrangement with Edward as a threat to this independence. Though the movie never follows up on this too explicitly, there is this moment after Vivian feels disrespected and objectified by Edward.
I hate to point out the obvious, but you are in fact a hooker, and you are my employee.
You don't own me, I decide, okay? I say who, I say when, I say who!
I refuse to spend the next 3 days fighting with you. I said I was sorry, I meant it. That's the end of it.
What the film never does is interrogate the simplicity of its fairy tale ending. Vivian is taken from her life on the street to a life with Edward, but she quickly sacrifices her supposed independence. While Vivian says she chooses when and with who, so much of her existence is determined by the coercion that all workers experience under capitalism. Edward, as part of the moneyed elite, is immune to this, and the film assumes that a life with him will be an easy one for Vivian. But she would be sacrificing power of her own in order to do this. Pretty Woman portrays a grim reality for women, where a choice exists between capitalist exploitation and the supposed easy life of marrying a wealthy man. While Edward has shown some change throughout the film, it never deals with the core problem that his massive wealth causes for society. The fact that people so wealthy can exist at all only happens because of structural inequalities, and women have historically been hindered from achieving their own wealth, usually being best able to achieve this through marrying a man of means. It is hard to imagine what Vivian and Edward's life would really be like after the credits roll. This is where all romantic comedies end, assuming that the getting together is the interesting part of the story, and not the building a life together part. Would Edward really continue to respect Vivian? Would she ever feel she had true power or agency in their relationship? The film does not ask these questions, just as Pride and Prejudice does not ask this about Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy. Ultimately, Pretty Woman is a product of the early 90s, a post-feminist and post-Reagan era attempt to reconcile competing values that had been embraced by the culture. The values of this film would be evocative of the values of the 90s to come, and many of the films of that decade. When trying to have it both ways in terms of gender and capitalism would increasingly become the norm. Now that the romantic comedy genre seems all but dead, the reason seems to be an inability to deal with what would come next after discarding the dynamics that the romantic comedy has always explored. If the genre is able to ever have a revival, it would need to deal with the messy complexity of the world we now live in a way that would be satisfying to audiences. In a way, Pretty Woman functions as a look back to a time where we thought we could have it all, and that may be where its power to still draw audiences comes from.